hopefully you can see my screen now. Cool.
Yes.
All right. Well, Gavin's already introduced me, so there's not much more to say about who I am. Just to say what I'm going to be talking about. I've already seen in the chat that I've been called the Power Query guy. Actually, this is another subject that is very close to my heart. I've been around in the Microsoft BI community for a very long time, doing analysis services and Power Pivot and other things well before Power BI came along. And along the way, I've really grown to love and appreciate Excel. You know, I'll be honest, I come from a very IT department, corporate BI type background, but I really do love Excel, and I think it's a great tool for a lot of things, not just for consuming Power BI data. So that's why I'm always particularly interested in all of the new features that Excel has for integrating with Power BI, and that's what we'll be covering today. Something very important to say before we carry on, though, it's that there are going to be some things that we are not going to talk about. And the one thing we are not going to talk about is export to Excel. There will be absolutely nothing in this presentation about export to Excel. Instead, we are going to only look at the features and options in Power BI for building reports in Excel from data that is stored in a Power BI dataset and stays in a Power BI dataset. This is, I think, the best way of using Power BI and Excel together. So, what are we going to talk about? We'll talk about why you want to use Power BI and Excel together, and the advantages from a Power BI point of view and the advantages from the Excel point of view. And then for most of the presentation, I'll be doing demos of functionality. Some of this functionality has been around for quite a long time. Some of it is very new and hopefully works properly. And then talk a little bit about publishing and sharing. I'm aiming to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I'll be around for taking questions afterwards, if that's okay. And yeah, specifically, I'll take the questions at the end rather than take questions during the presentation. So let's talk a little bit before we get on to the demos. The first question I want to talk about is why use Power BI with Excel? If you're an Excel person, why are you going to use some of the features I'm going to talk about here? Because I work on the Power BI customer advisory team, and most of my job is dealing with questions from customers, trying to help them. And one of the most common questions that I see coming from customers, one of the most common questions that I think everybody sees from in the Power BI world is I want to export to Excel. How do I do that? And B, well, exporting to Excel has lots of limitations. Why isn't it better in Power BI? Why don't we have a better solution? And just to recap some of the obvious things that I think everybody knows about export to Excel and why it's bad. If you get stuck in a cycle of exporting to Excel from Power BI or from any tool, you're stuck in essentially a manual process. Ever since the beginning of Excel, other tools have had an export to Excel button, and as a result, there have been people whose entire job has been to go to work and in the morning open up whatever source system they need to connect to, press the export to Excel button, download an Excel worksheet or a CSV file or something, bring that into Excel somehow, maybe through copying and pasting, then delete some stuff, reshape some stuff, maybe run an Excel macro, munge things generally, and then get it into the shape that somebody's predefined Excel report needs to do. Now, apart from that being a very tedious, boring process, it's also something that somebody has to do manually every day. And I think we all know that there are going to be, we've all seen situations where somebody has gone away on holiday, or they've left the company, or they've fallen under a bus, and they were the only person that knew how to build that Excel report in the morning. and the entire company has come to a halt as a result because everybody depended on this Excel report. So exporting to Excel is bad because it's a manual operation and it breaks really, really easily. And of course, another problem with exporting to Excel is that as soon as you've got one person doing it, then other people spring up to do the same thing, which then means that everybody's exporting to Excel at different times with slightly different versions of the data. They're doing different copy and paste operations. They're making different assumptions. And you end up with lots and lots of different versions of the same data that never really seem to match up. Power BI gives you the ability to create that golden data set with one version of the data and one version of your business logic in. Exporting to Excel just leads to Excel hell. Another problem that Excel has is that it's got a limited amount of data that it can handle. Now, I know that that's not quite true if you're using Power Pivot, but even with Power Pivot, I think the data volumes you can work with on the desktop are nowhere near as large as the data volumes that you can work with in a Power BI data set. And then finally, Excel is just not as fast as Power BI for aggregating data and doing certain types of calculations. So export to Excel is bad. And if you're an Excel user thinking about using export to Excel, well, don't. There is a better way. Now let's flip the question around and think about if I'm a Power BI user, and I guess most people here are going to be, really keen Power BI users. Why should I care about building reports in Excel on top of Power BI? Because, surely Power BI reports are better than Excel reports, aren't they? And, even if we've got Power BI reports, we've also got paginated reports in Power BI. Why do I need a third tool to build a report? Well, I would say there are a couple of reasons why you as a Power BI developer should care about Excel as a tool for consuming data from Power BI. First of all, Power BI is all about democratizing data access. It's making data available to as many people as possible. And while Power BI is really, really great, if you really want to reach as many people as possible, you should use the tool that everybody knows. And that tool is going to be Excel. Everybody knows Excel to a certain extent. My kids, when they were 8 or 9, learned Excel in school. That's how ubiquitous Excel is. And that means that even if there is a better way of doing something in Power BI, sometimes the only way that your users will know to do something is with Excel. And if you can teach them maybe just one thing, which is how to connect Excel up to Power BI, it means that you don't have to teach them an awful lot of other things. They might know how to build a particular data visualization in Excel. Maybe they would have to be taught how to do that in Power BI. Perhaps more relevantly, there are going to be some types of calculation that perhaps they can do in Excel formulas that turn out to be really quite complicated to do in DAX. And, let's face it, even Power BI professionals struggle with complicated DAX. So I would say that there is there's a democracy argument for using Excel. It's the tool that everybody knows and loves. But there are going to be some positive arguments, I say, for using Excel with Power BI as well. And Excel certainly does some things better with Power BI data than Power BI reports or paginated reports. Probably the number one thing that I would say or call out is exploring data with PivotTables. The number of times I have seen people try to build Power BI reports that do something similar to an Excel pivot table, it's just not funny. Some people tie themselves in incredible knots, building really complicated DAX calculations and doing complex modeling just to build something that looks like a pivot table. And even in Power BI now, we have the visual personalization feature that was released late last year. That's really basically an attempt to give you pivot table-like functionality. But if what you want is a pivot table, why not use a pivot table? pivot tables are great. Pivot tables are really mature. Everybody knows how to use them. So why not use a pivot table for just exploring your data? Not necessarily presenting data to other people, but if you want to see what's there in your data to just have a poke around, there is nothing like a pivot table. So I would say that's the number one strength for what I'm going to show. There are other, I think, reasons for using Excel for certain report types as well. If you're interested in building financial reports, some of you will know how difficult it is to get a financial report layout in Power BI. There are custom visuals that do it. There are people who've written kind of quite long, complicated workarounds on how to build a kind of financial report layout in Power BI. But to be honest, Excel has certain functionality, cube functions, for example, that make it very easy to build these more complicated layouts. And, more complicated layouts than I would say are possible in either regular Power BI reports or paginated reports. So there are going to be other reasons, we'll certainly come across them, I'm sure, when we talk about the, come to the questions. But those are my arguments for why I want to do what I'm going to show you. Now, let's go over to the demos and show you what we need to do. So just to be clear, we're not exporting to Excel. We are connecting from Excel to Power BI. And the first thing to understand, the first thing we need to do is to understand how to make a connection between Excel and your dataset in Power BI. There are actually two different ways of doing it. You can either start in Power BI and then create a new Excel workbook connected to what you're looking at in Power BI, or you can start in Excel and then connect up to a dataset in Power BI. So let's see both of those things. Let me go over to my browser and we'll go to Power BI first of all. So what I've got here is a Power BI workspace. It's a premium per user workspace, but most of what I'm going to show here is nothing to do with premium, and it's not reliant on anything here. And I've got a Power BI dataset here. We'll talk a little bit about what's in the dataset in a moment. But if I want to create a link from an Excel file up to this dataset, the first way that I can do this is just to go to here, click on the ellipses, click on Analyze in Excel. The Analyze in Excel link is available in other different places inside the Power BI workspace UI, but I've downloaded a little file here. This is an ODC file. So it's a very small file. It doesn't contain any data. All it does is contain connection information that when you click on it, or you've downloaded it, it will open up Excel with a connection already created to your Power BI dataset. So let me just enable editing. And there is a pivot table. There we go. And hooray, that has, let that wake up a little bit. There we go. And there's my pivot table. It is important to understand that there is no data in this Excel file right now, but I have a pivot table connected up to my Power BI dataset. And every time I do something in my pivot table, like bring in count of sales here, or drag month name onto rows, Excel is generating a query to get the data from my Power BI dataset. Now, this functionality is nothing new. It has been in Excel for almost 20 years. It was something that was built for Excel and Power and SQL Server analysis services integration. But because Power BI is based on the same technology that's used by analysis services, what works in Excel for analysis services also works for a Power BI dataset. Now, we'll come back in a moment and talk about pivot tables in a bit more detail, but this is one way of creating the connection. If I go back to the browser, there's something else to point out. If I go over to here, something that's worth pointing out on this side is the new Power BI Datasets Hub. This is something that was released in preview, I think, in December last year. And it's the place in the Power BI service you can go to find all of your data sets, specifically for this type of scenario for wanting to build a new report. So here is the Power BI dataset that I was just looking at. I can click on this to go to the page. Come on. All right. Don't tell me my internet is going to be slow. There we go. That's what I wanted, actually. Here we are. We go to the page for this particular data set. All right. We will just refresh it one more time. But maybe that's not going to work. Let's just go back to here. We will close that. Anyway. All right, it looks like Edge has crashed, but we'll just close that. There we go. But I'll be able to go, I could go to the datasets hub, and basically this would just give me another link to the dataset. So that's how to create a connection from Power BI. But to be honest, if you're building something in Excel, you probably want to start in Excel. And so what I prefer to do is actually start with a new empty Excel workbook. Let's close that and don't save it. And create a connection from there. And there are a couple of different ways that we can create connections from Excel. So this is an empty Excel workbook. If I want to create a connection, I can go to Data, Get Data from Power BI. So this will create a pivot table connected to Power BI. This has been around for a while in the newer versions of Excel 365. Something that is new and something I can show for the first time today, which some of you, even the really experienced people, might not have seen. Now in the version of Excel that I've got, I can go to Insert, Pivot Table, and you can see here that there is a new option here to insert a pivot table from Power BI on this list. And to be honest, this is how I like to do things now. I'm going to click to insert a pivot table based on connected to a Power BI dataset. A new pane opens on the right-hand side, showing all the list of datasets that I've got. Clearly, things are going to be very slow today. There we go. I'm going to search for my dataset. And once again, it's going to build my pivot table connected to Power BI. And, as I've said, I've got a couple of different measures here. I can click to select the measures. I could, for example, drag this field called property type name down here. Let's maybe increase the zoom level. I can add month name as a filter here. I could add this county column here as a slicer. And what I've got is something that works effectively in the same way as any other Excel pivot table. So I can select something, I can slice and dice. My pivot table will change. See, as soon as I change something in the slicer, or I change something in my filter over here, see the numbers change. Every time that I change something in a slicer or a filter, Excel generates a query to go back to the Power BI dataset to get the data new. So it's not exporting. This is dynamically querying the data from my dataset. So this is a pivot table connected to Power BI. And as I said, pivot tables are great for data exploration. If you just want to see what's there in your data, or you want to let your end users explore data in the data set without having to go to all of the trouble of building a Power BI report, I think this is a great option. And I think this is, personally, I think this is better as an option for exploring data than going and having to build a matrix or a table inside a Power BI report. But this is only one way of getting data from your Power BI dataset into Power BI. The second thing that I want to show you is also a bit of functionality that has been around in Power BI, in Excel for quite a long time, more than 10 years, which was also built for analysis services, which works for Power BI as well. And it's the Excel cube functions. The Excel cube functions are a very little known bit of functionality, but I think they're really powerful, and I really like using them. So Excel cube functions do something very different from a pivot table. Pivot tables are great for exploring data, but if you're thinking about building a report from the pivot table, there are a number of limitations. For example, with a pivot table, you've got limitations about how you format a pivot table. Yes, you can apply a format to a pivot table, but a pivot table does always end up looking a bit like a pivot table, or at least something like a table. And you don't always want a report to look like that. And so a lot of people I've seen create pivot tables and then use formulas to look up values inside a pivot table to bring it into a more formatted type report. Another problem with pivot tables is they have a nasty habit of growing or shrinking, which means that working with other Excel formulas and a pivot table can be quite tricky. So to kind of counteract that for different scenarios, you can use the Excel cube formulas to get data from a data set. The Excel cube formulas allow you to bind data from a data set to an individual cell in Excel. They're Excel functions. They've been around for quite a long time. You can create you can use the Excel cube formulas like any other formula just by typing in cells in Excel. But it's also really easy to create a range of cells containing cube formulas from an existing pivot table. So let's do that now. Here's my pivot table. I'm now going to go to the pivot table analyze pane on the ribbon up here. I'm going to go to OLAP tools and convert to formulas. When I do that and click convert here, my pivot table is going to disappear. There will be no more pivot table. I've got cells that contain the same data that the pivot table had in it, but they are now cells containing formulas in Excel. Here we've got the two most important cube member functions, cube functions, cube member and cube value. Cube member is used to get the data that used to be on the rows or columns of the pivot table. Cube value is the function that gets the numeric data from the body of the pivot table. But even here, it's still connected live back to my Power BI dataset. So when I change my slicer or change my filter, the data still changes. So this again is not new. This is something that's been around for a very long time. And the great thing about this is because this is just cells with formulas in, I can format it however I want. I can do that. It's still fine. I could maybe insert a row here. It still all works because it's all just Excel formulas. Now, that's great. Like I said, Excel cube functions are really, really useful as a way of building more complex layouts, for example, for financial reports. We do also have something fairly new, which is a third option for getting data from cells into an Excel workbook. And this is something called organizational data types. Now, I've always loved Excel cube formulas, but to be honest, however much I love them, I know that they are not a failure, but they are more complicated than I think most users ever want to use. To be honest, people, even people who've learnt about Excel cube formulas, find them quite complex to work with. So what the Excel team have done is come up with an easier way of bringing data from Power BI datasets and indeed other sources into Excel. These are data types. So if you've got a reasonably recent version of Excel, you may have seen data types available up here. There are a large number of data types now built into Excel for particular topics. So for example, I could type something into here, MSFT, and say that this is a stock. And it will recognize this as the Microsoft stock symbol. And I can now go to B2 and say, what's the number of employees? 63,000. I've got that. Now, this is public data. This is something that is just available to all Excel users. But if you've got data in Power BI, you can also make data in Power BI available through data types like this. Takes a little bit of setup work. But if I go to Power BI Desktop and show you the data set that I was using a little bit earlier, the first thing that you have to do is you need to click on a table in your data set and turn on this is featured table option here. Now, this is going to be a really, really simple example. Here we go. But you can give it a description. You need to have a row label and a row identifier for this particular table. But what I've got here in this data set is information about real estate property sales in the UK. And one of the things you might have noticed from here is that I've got property types and the number of sales and the average price paid for each of these property types. And I've got a property type called detached, a property type for flat, semi-detached, terraced. These are all specifically British terms that if you're in the audience and you're from the UK, you'll probably understand what a semi-detached house is very easily. But even if you're a native English speaker coming from the US, or you're a very good English speaker coming from Europe, you're probably thinking, what on earth is a semi-detached house or a detached house or a terraced house? This is where we can start to do some cool stuff with Excel data types. Because I've set up an Excel data type on that particular table, and I can type semi-detached into here. Let's zoom in a little bit. At the moment, this is just text in a cell, but I can now click on that cell, go to data, go to more from your organization, because this is something that is specifically for me. I can say that this is a property type. It will be turned into an Excel data type. You can see this little kind of box icon next to it. And now I can start typing some Excel formulas that say B2 dot description. And I can say that a semi-detached house is a house that is connected to one other house. I could start to get some measure data. So if I was interested in the count of sales, I could put that here and then say B2 dot count of sales. I've got that. As you probably know, you can set up images and have URLs that point to images in Power BI. With that set up, I can exclusively show you today that with Excel data types, at least in my version of Excel, I can go to my property type image field, which in my Power BI dataset has a URL pointing to an image on the internet. And now I can even get the image that that URL points to, and you can see a semi-detached house inside Excel. So this is still fairly new. There are a lot of improvements to come for Excel data types, but you can see how you can build reports in Excel that have this kind of cell-by-cell link to data stored in Power BI. There's more as well. I said right at the beginning, I'm a Power Query type of guy. Sometimes instead of a pivot table or individual cells, you just want a table of data in Excel. And in fact, there are two different ways that you can get tables of data in Excel. If you've got your data set in premium or premium per user, you can actually connect Power Query in Excel up to the XMLA endpoint for your data set. So I've just copied the workspace connection for my XML endpoint. I'm going to go to get data from database, and I'm going to choose this option to get data from analysis services and import the data. So I'm going to go to from database import. Might take a little bit of time because Power Query needs to wake up, obviously. Come on, come on. Here we go. I paste that XMLA endpoint into the server box here. I could enter my own DAX or MDX query here, but I'm just going to click OK. And we wait and wait. I suspect this is Teams using up all my bandwidth as well. That is making everything go slow. And if I haven't entered an MDX or DAX query here, I can still use Power Query's query builder options to generate my query. So let's go to my price paid data set here, and I can navigate down. Come on, and let's grab, for example, county, and we will grab perhaps one measure to make this a little bit faster. I promise you it's not usually this slow. Let's take these guys. And this is now just Power Query. I can do all of my Power BI stuff. And I could go to the Power Query editor and change this. But in fact, all I'm going to do is click load. And this will then use Power Query to get a table of data into my Excel worksheet. That again can be refreshed. There we go. Stop that. All right. There is also another option for getting data into Excel, into an Excel table. So this is an Excel table bound to a Power Query query. I could also go back to my original pivot table. All right, I've got lost in my pivot table. And it's also possible to create a table from a pivot table and change the DAX query associated with that as well. But to be honest, I always prefer using Power Query for this type of thing. So those are all of our options for getting data into Excel from Power BI without importing. The last thing that I want to talk about is publishing reports. Now, a lot of the functionality that I've showed you here has been around in Power BI and Excel for a long time. You know, there's been a lot of nice changes to make it easier to find. The organizational data types are new, but pivot tables and cube formulas connected up to Power BI datasets, they've been around for a really, really long time. The real limiting factor for using this for building reports to share with other people has been that these features only worked in Excel on the desktop. But this is just about to change. In a few weeks, maybe a few months, depending on which version of Excel you've got installed, you will be able to build Excel reports connected to Power BI on the desktop and then publish them and view them in the browser. So there are two ways of doing this. I'm only going to be able to show you one of them because the other one isn't working today for some reason. It's still all a little bit buggy because this is pre-release stuff. But let's go to the browser. I have created an Excel file up here with data connected to my Power BI dataset. This is OneDrive for Business. I'm going to open up this Excel file in the browser. This is an Excel file with pivot tables and cube formulas and organizational data types in. Let's turn on images. Let's first of all go and have a look at pivot tables, because I think this proves the point. We go to the pivot table. And here, not only is a pivot table that is connected to my data set, I can change my filters and slicers. So let's change the month here. Click OK. And it all just works. Let's change the layout. Let's move that from there. Let's put ownership type on there. And I can slice and dice with my pivot table in the browser in exactly the same way that I could on the desktop. So I can create pivot tables that I share with other people that they can interact with. Something that doesn't work today, I had hoped to show, you can also publish Excel workbooks, of course, up to a Power BI workspace, which then means that you can have Excel reports stored in a workspace in the same way that you can have paginated reports and regular Power BI reports inside your workspace. And of course, they will all work and your users will be able to interact with them and change slices and filters in exactly the way that I've shown. So Excel in the browser works with pivot tables. It works with cube formulas. It also works with organizational data types. It doesn't work with Power Query yet. Power Query at the moment has very limited, very limited functionality as far as Excel Online goes. But it is in our long-term plan, and I can say this because it has been mentioned publicly. It is in our long-term plan for Power Query to work with Excel Online, which will open up a lot more functionality than is even what I'm talking about here. All right, that brings me to the end of my presentation. We've got a little bit of time left for questions. I can see there are lots of questions in the chat, so I'm happy to answer questions.
So I'll try and run through them, Chris, and hopefully it'll save you scrolling up and down as well. So the first one, so Jessica asked, setting the parameters on your report for underlying in Power BI, right? So for underlying data set or summarized data set, does that make any difference to this particular experience? We can still get all of the data.
So it depends on what you mean by parameters. If you're talking about
options and settings, yeah, and defining what data can be exported from your report. And I think you have summarized only or underlying and summarized, or not export at all.
This is not export. So those options have nothing to do with this. You will need to have build permissions to be able to use all of this, though. So effectively, you'll need the same permissions to build a report in Excel that you would to open up Power BI desktop and build a report with a live connection to your data set.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of questions around kind of licensing and versions and so on. Is there any specific versions or subscription levels of M365 needed to do this, or will it be kind of generally available as, from an Excel perspective?
So everything that I've shown you here will work, I believe, with E3 and E5 for sure.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it works with all kind of corporate versions of Excel. I don't think it works with Excel Home, but any versions of Excel that you're likely to be using at work, this should all work.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure about organizational data types, but certainly pivot tables and cube formulas should work.
Okay, good. And then a couple of questions on the formatting around on the cube value stuff. So Johanna's asked about the formatting of so if you actually created a table with contained cube values and you put a comment next to a particular row or something similar, when you refresh that next time around, will that comment stay in the same place? So if you added a comment for flat, let's say, in column D or something similar, when you refresh that, would that stay in the same place?
It would, because with cube formulas, there is no automatic growing or shrinking.
Okay.
Cube formulas are literally just like any other Excel formula. They are formulas inside cells, and they don't dynamically grow or shrink at all. That's one of the limitations of cube formulas. So, for example, if there was another property type that got added to the Power BI table, I'd have to manually go in here and add it.
Right. Okay. That's worth noting, definitely. And then I guess the formatting. There was a question from Chewy about the formatting.
Mm-hmm.
Will the format prevail be linked to the data point itself? So obviously, when you kind of made, those the house types bold, or even one of the average prices or something similar,
Mm-hmm.
would that actually stick with that particular data point if you formatted it differently?
Yes, it would, because
Okay.
this is just, these are again just values in Excel. You'll see that, for average price paid here, where a format has been displayed in Power BI, that format is honored in Excel though.
Okay. Cool. And then a question about the ODC connection string or the ODC file. If you actually connected to a workspace that was backed by premium capacity in any
Mm-hmm.
version of that, premium embedded or PPU, would that also contain the XMLA connection string in the ODC file as well?
Yes, it would. We've been doing some work in the background to try and kind of at the moment, in the past, we've had XMLA endpoints and we've had the kind of analyze in Excel connections that you can use without a premium capacity. There's been a little bit of work to try and make them look like the other and make sure that things don't break when you move between premium and non-premium workspaces.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it should all just work fine.
Okay, and Barasan asked, and maybe hopefully I haven't butchered that name too much with my pronunciation. If the data model is in direct query, if you actually import it through AAS, can you export the data from Excel?
Yes, but I don't know why you would import a direct query dataset through AAS. So nothing I've shown here has anything to do with AAS.
No, so I think if you had a Power BI model that was using direct query, I think when you actually said you went to get data from the model, I think there was a point where you said from an AS style, or at least. I guess the simpler question is,
does this work with direct query?
And does it
Yes.
stop you from exporting the data? Because really, that's the non-cached stuff of direct query is important for people from a data security point of view, as Anna Barrison points out.
So I'm I'm still not quite sure I understand the question, but yes, this all works with direct query.
Okay. So that might be something, Anna Barrison, you might just need to try yourself and see what that happens.
Sure thing. Thanks again.
Okay, and there was a question then from I didn't catch the name, sorry. So it was the Power Query example. Where does the processing occur that imported the Excel table? On the end user's end or in the Power BI service, or maybe even a bit of both, perhaps?
So in the Power Query example that I showed, all that's happening is Power Query is generating a query to get the data from Power BI in the same way that the pivot table does as well. So there's very little happening in Excel in that example. Here, when I refresh this, there's obviously a Power Query query in the background, but that is generating, in this case, an MDX query to get the data from Power BI.
Okay. And there's probably one or two more. So another question about the licensing. So I think you said E3 and above should be able to support this.
Yeah, so I think you've kind of caught me underprepared there for licensing. But I know this will definitely work with E3.
Okay, fine. Oh, that's good. And then a question from Arno. So does this mean that Power Pivot will also become functional with shared Excel files saved in a SharePoint OneDrive location? Should I get that?
I don't know if I can comment on that, but
okay, no, that's fine. We understand.
Maybe you should try that yourself.
Okay, good
But
answer.
yes, nothing has been announced yet. So remember, nothing has been announced yet.
And then I guess all the other things as well, general questions around kind of row-level security and all those aspects. And now with OLS as well, I assume that even though you have build right on that data set, all of those things will still be respected.
All of this respects security, yes.
Okay.
Because all it's doing, all of these things I've shown you, they're all just generating queries and they all respect security. And in fact, to be honest, OLS in Power BI doesn't really work very well with Power BI reports, because if you're going in as a user who's a member of a role with OLS applied, it can break Power BI reports in some cases. But this was functionality that was really primarily built for the people who were using Excel on top of Azure Analysis Services or Analysis Services on-prem. So, if you've got OLS in your applied on your data set, then Excel will work pretty well on that. Okay.
And then the one, I guess, kind of on the data information security aspect as well. If you saved this Excel file now and emailed it to me, for example, would I be able to actually access the data within that Excel file?
You might see something when you first opened it, but you're not going to be able to refresh unless you've got access to the underlying data set.
Okay, that makes sense. Just make sure that I think that covers it. So Jochen asked, is there a roadmap for accessing Power BI data flows direct in Excel? Maybe that might be a bit of a left field question and you may not be able to give an answer.
I know the answer, but I can't.
Okay.
Not sure I can say it, I'm afraid.
That's fine.
But it is something that we hear from a lot of customers.
Yes. Okay.
Put it like that.
No, I think we get the drift, I think. Okay, so I think Sylvia just asked another question, but we said E3 and above we know, or you can definitely add E3 and above. It will work fine from a Office M365 subscription perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty much it. If anyone If I've missed any questions and anyone want to kind of retype or take themselves off mute and shout up, we've probably only got another couple of minutes, and that's it. Okay.
So I saw.
Chris, can I ask a question? Hi, thanks for the session anyway. Just to clarify on the E3 question, so E3 doesn't have Power BI Pro, so then non-Power BI Pro users will be able to use it.
So this is all going to rely on the user having a Power BI Pro subscription. So Power BI licensing is completely separate to Excel. So you are going to need to have a Power BI Pro license to do this.
Yep. So it'd be E3 plus Power BI Pro.
Yes, you will need to have Excel. Yes, an appropriate level license for Excel, and you're going to need to really have different things will work with different versions of Excel, but ideally you will have the M365 Excel, which updates automatically every month, and have Beyond one of the fast rings for it as well.
Cheers, thanks for that.
Okay, Pedro had quite a few questions, but we're probably not going to get into those. But I think some of that, Pedro, maybe do some experimentation yourself, and that was around the kind of pivot table expanding, collapsing, reusing cube members instead, top 10 cube members by measure. And there's probably too many questions.
Yeah, you can do that using the cube set function. But that will require writing some. Look at the cube set function. That will get you that's a way of getting a dynamic top 10. The thing to understand with cube members is that they cannot at the moment grow or shrink. So long as you know you're only getting 10 things, you can use the cube set function to get your top 10 and make that a dynamic top 10, but it will only ever contain 10 things. 10. You couldn't have something that changed from 10 to 15 to 20 and be able to display that dynamically, because cube members and cube value, they're all bound to an individual cell.
That makes sense. I think that's it, really. So can you now just demonstrate export to Excel, please?
No, because I hate that, and I absolutely refuse to do that.
All right, thanks very much. A lot of kind of good feedback on the session as well, Chris. So it was really, really good. So just one final question came in there about data gateways, but I assume that's all around access to the underlying data set as well. And if your gateway is only refreshing on a certain cycle, then that's Excel will have the data up to the date of the last refresh.
Yeah. Nothing that I've shown here is anything to do with the data gateway.
Yeah. Handling social media, SEO, email. Okay, thank you very much. Someone got that right. Brilliant session, Chris. That was really interesting, very thought-provoking, and I think that it opens up a lot of new possibilities, which is really great.
Cool. There's a lot more cool stuff to come in this area over the next couple of months.
Brilliant. Okay. Do you have time for one more question, if possible? So Anna Barrison asked for one more, if that was possible. Do you want to take yourself off mute? Anna Barrison is probably easier to ask.
Sure thing. Thanks, Chris. Sorry to bug you in the very last minute. Much appreciated. It's a great session. The question is around going back to the same direct, the feature that you showed us, connect to analysis service, import connector, and then extract data. Suppose if I have a direct query based model, and for which the source is the security model is controlled at the source level. So if, say, for example, SQL Server, and I deploy that one as a part of the app, and I deploy the app to multiple user. I give read connection to the app underlying dataset, the metadata dataset. If I do so, and if I do import using this connector, would I be able to extract data from SQL? I'm purely talking from a security perspective. Whether if we go on any of that such path, are we exposing ourselves to a wider community that they can potentially extract data where the source control, the security control is maintained at the source level using service account?
Yes, but I would be very hesitant about recommending that. I would say that if you've got your data in SQL and you've got and you're just thinking about building a direct query model to allow people to extract through Power Query, you might as well just let people connect back to SQL Server direct from Power Query, because it's going to be an awful lot easier, and it's going to be a lot faster to do as well.
I'm not proposing that we would probably be doing that as a deployment model, but I'm just trying to cover if there is a security angle that we need to think. If we deploy through a direct query model and give permission to the app to connect to the underlying data, we may potentially leave the hole for anyone to extract the data as into a granular level, because connecting to unaggregated data is fine. But if the user can extract much more granular level data as what the underlying model is exposed to, would that be possible through this route? So
if somebody has got access to your cube and they've got build permissions to be able to build Power BI reports, and your data set, and they've got build permissions on it, either from Power BI or Excel, they're going to be able to extract whatever data they've got access to, assuming that row levels, apart from whatever they've had restricted with row level security. Generally speaking, when people are worried about people extracting detail level data, there are two things they're worried about. First of all, they're worried about people getting access to detail level data that they shouldn't be able to see. In that situation, I would say if you're worried about that, don't put that detail level data in the Power BI dataset. Just import aggregated data. The other problem, which is maybe more difficult, is the fact that people love to be able to export to Excel from Power BI, and if there's detailed data in there, they will go away and get vast amounts of data, which can cause performance problems, and that's a harder thing to deal with.
Right.
But it's difficult to really kind of give you a full answer just in a quick conversation like this. Absolutely. But I would be, generally speaking, I would be quite cautious about using Power Query on top of a direct query data set, going back to SQL Server, because like I said, there's too many layers and there's too many opportunities for things to go slow. It would be much easier if you wanted to give people access to the data through Power Query and Excel, just to give them access to the SQL Server data directly.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Cool.
Yeah,
all right.
Thank you very much, Chris. Brilliant. Great session. Still some chat going on, so we'll try and answer those. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot.
And hopefully speak again soon.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.